Hi, and welcome to Educating Marshmallow. This is the Hamlet series, part 2 of 4, and we're going to look at some passages from the play now. First passage I want to look at is dialogue between the Queen, Gertrude, and Hamlet. And Hamlet is still dressed for a funeral, even though there's been a very recent marriage at Elsinore. And the Queen is sort of pleading with him to stop looking so gloomy. And she says, "Thou knowst 'tis common, all that lives must die." And he agrees, "Yes, aye, madam, it is common." And then she asks, "Why seems it so particular with thee?" And he replies very, grumpily, "Seems, madam? Nay, it is, I know not seems." Very famous line. So Hamlet is sort of disclaiming any awareness that one could pretend to be sad. "I know not seems." And yet he goes on in the same speech to give quite a list of things that you could do to seem sadder than you really are. "'Tis not alone my inky cloak, good mother, nor customary suits of solemn black, nor the fruitful river in the eye, the dejected havior of the visage. These indeed seem, for they are actions that a man might play. But I have that within which passeth show, these but the trappings and the suits of woe." So Hamlet gives a very nice little speech, complete with a rhymed couplet at the end, to show that despite what he says, he does know a lot about seeming. He's well aware that the clothing he's wearing could be worn inauthentically, that it could just be for show. But he is claiming to have an inner authenticity that goes beyond his external garments. And it's that inner authenticity that Hamlet seems to be privileging in this scene, and that we want to really keep in mind as the play goes along. Because he seems to be feeling here that he's the only person in Denmark even, certainly at the court, who is actually authentic at all. However, as the play goes on, we see that that authenticity comes into serious question. In scene 4, Hamlet is about to go and meet the ghost. And you'd think his mind would be on that, because the ghost is his father's ghost. But Hamlet has something else in mind. A sort of obscure train of thought takes hold of him. He and Horatio are discussing the drunkenness that obtains in the court of Denmark, and Hamlet's saying that this is a blot on our reputation. And then he says, "So oft it chances in particular men." This happens with individual people too. That for some vicious mole of nature in them, as in their birth, wherein they are not guilty, since nature cannot choose his origin, by their o'ergrowth of some complexion, oft breaking down the pales and forts of reason. These people can get in trouble, Hamlet is saying, because of some humor. That was the theory of the day, that we all had 4 humors in our bodies. That's what Hamlet means by a complexion. That if we had too much of one humor, too much bile, let's say, we were prone to get angry, and that would ruin the divine spirit of reason that would otherwise rule our actions. So far, Hamlet is sort of spouting a fairly conventional theory of the time. However, he goes on to say, "Or by some habit that too much o'erleavens the form of plausive manners, that these men, carrying, I say, the stamp of one defect, his virtues else be they as pure as grace, shall in the general censure take corruption from that particular fault." So this phrase, "some habit that too much o'erleavens the form of plausive manners," I'm going to suggest is affectation. Plausive manners means pleasing manners. And Hamlet is pointing to something that's very important in the sort of decorum of the day, that you always want to try to please with your manners, but if you are trying too hard to please, sometimes you can go overboard and produce an unintended consequence where people judge you harshly. But the very idea that a great person, right, someone who's noble, virtuous, whatever, however excellent the person may be, in one little mannerism, and Michel de Montaigne, the famous essayist, whose works are often read in conjunction with Shakespeare and Hamlet in particular, Montaigne talks about an affectation, and he uses that word, that Alexander had of craning his neck a little bit, and that's what people will register. Even if the person is a wonderful, virtuous human, they can come to grief. They can have a reputation ruined by this tiny little defect in their manners, in much the same way as some liquid in their bodies could overflow, boil up, and cause them to erupt in rage or something like that. So Hamlet is preoccupied with this idea that a very minor, superficial fault in his manners, in anyone's manners, can be his downfall, which is a weird thing to be worrying about when you're going to meet the ghost of your father. However, it gets back to the same problem of authenticity, right? That if you are guilty of some affectation, right, some habit that you picked up, let's say, by imitating someone else, holding your head to one side because it's fashionable or whatever, that might be some serious, even tragic flaw in your character, that outward affectation betrays some inner inauthenticity. And that phrase, vicious mole of nature, recalls the idea that affectation is a vice. It's not only a rhetorical mistake, it's something much deeper than that can betray an inner inauthenticity. And again, that's Hamlet's preoccupation early in the play. So Hamlet's authenticity takes a really huge hit after he sees the ghost and receives the ghost's message that not only was his father murdered, but he was murdered by Claudius, who has married Hamlet's mother and taken the throne of Denmark. So here Hamlet, following in the tradition of other previous Hamlets from Norse legend, decides to pretend to be insane. And in those older legends, Hamlet is often pictured as a very young prince who just is too, immature, not even physically developed enough to be able to take physical revenge. So what he can do, though, is disguise his knowledge of his father's murder by pretending to be crazy. So Hamlet adopts what he himself calls this antic disposition. And a lot of people since have just referred to it as Hamlet's affectation of madness, that he is really, he's not crazy by any means. He is pretending to be crazy, but his performance of insanity is affectation itself. And a lot of the things that he does, he promises to do rather, with Horatio, as part of this antic disposition, have to do with him shaking his head in some funny way, holding his arms in some strange fashion, adopting a weird habit, right, that is redolent of affectation, as we just saw in that speech on the vicious mole of nature. Or he says by pronouncing some doubtful phrase as, well, we know we could, and if we would, or if we list to speak, there be, and if there might, or such ambiguous giving out, as he puts it. So these little verbal habits that Hamlet says he's going to adopt are themselves warning signs of affectation. If we list to speak, that's kind of redundant. Ambiguity itself, a doubtfulness was another word for it in early modern English. Ambiguity itself was often deemed to be a sign of affectation, of pretending to be mysterious and all the rest of it. So Hamlet has gone from this preoccupation with authenticity, which differentiates him from the rest of the court of Denmark, who were hypocrites, basically, who mourned the dead king just long enough to get to the marriage of the new king, who's actually a usurper and a murderer. Hamlet's gone from that concern with authenticity to the affectation of insanity as a self-protective device. And we sort of see that Hamlet kind of goes from one state to another very quickly throughout the course of the play, because that's how the action sort of compels him to behave in a certain way. But he does not yet have the word affectation to talk about it. However, we soon encounter another example of just that sort of verbal affectation that Hamlet was starting to exhibit when he tells Horatio about his antic disposition. And it comes in the form of Polonius, the chief courtier at Elsinore, father of Laertes and Ophelia. And Polonius has been tasked with finding out what is the reason for Hamlet's insanity. You know, why everyone thinks he's crazy. Why has he gone crazy? Well, Polonius starts to give a little speech to explain all of this. And he says, since brevity is the soul of wit, and tedious is the limbs and outward flourishes, I will be brief. Your noble son is mad. Mad call I it, for to define true madness, what is to be but mad? But let that go. And the queen rightly interrupts him and says, more matter with less art. So Polonius, after promising to be brief, starts weaving these verbal webs where he is sort of playing around with words, and he's trying to exhibit his verbal skills at the expense of communicating a clear message. And when the queen asks for more matter, less art, she's echoing a long-standing saying about affectation, which is that it's art that shows itself to be artful, and at the expense of the matter that should be communicated. Any concern with the manner of one's verbal presentation is redolent of affectation. And Polonius knows, okay, I have to at least pretend to be playing by the rules of decorum. So he says, Madam, I swear I use no art at all. And this, in the rhetorical handbook, would be known as a remedium, basically a disclaimer saying, yes, I know the rules. Don't worry, I'm not going to be guilty of verbal affectation. I'm not going to use any art. But listen to what he says after he claims to use no art. That he's mad, 'tis true. 'Tis true, 'tis pity. And pity 'tis true. A foolish figure. But farewell it, for I will use no art. Well, he's using all kinds of art. And more importantly, his artfulness is obvious. It's on the surface. He's playing around with words. 'Tis true, 'tis pity, and pity 'tis true. That little switching around of the words. Chiasmus is one name for that rhetorical device. That, for an audience of Shakespeare's time, would be very reminiscent of John Lyly's writing. John Lyly is associated with the euphuistic movement in literature, where the style of Lyly's narrative was very heavily governed by that sort of chiasmus figure, or repeated rhythmical patterns in the sentences, words that were chosen to half rhyme with each other or echo each other. Hamlet uses a similar device when he says a little more than kin and less than kind. That's, in fact, the first thing he says in the play. The similarity between kin and kind, that's the kind of wordplay that's associated strongly with Lily and with euphuism, and Polonius has been strongly linked to Lily and euphuism as well. But anyway, we see basically that Polonius, even though he's aware that he's violating the decorum of the time, he's exhibiting verbal affectation, he can't help himself. And in a way, that's the nature of the problem of affectation in early modern rhetorical discourse. Montaigne, the French thinker, says basically, when I am writing, if I'm trying too hard to avoid affectation in one way, I fall into it by another way, which sort of shows us the vicious circle that we're in the play. That once we become aware of the problem of affectation, let's say as we're writing something, we realize that we could do something to show our basic inauthenticity. It's a version of imposter syndrome. So we strive to avoid that particular fault. In Montaigne's case, he was trying to avoid the fault of being euphuistic, having long flowing sentences that kind of say nothing but are too ornate for their own good. So he falls, but in avoiding that fault, he falls into the fault of being too brief and saying things that are so kind of terse as to be obscure. So Polonius is an example of someone who says, well, I'm not going to fall into the trap of affectation, but he can't help himself. And once we're aware that we can be inauthentic to ourselves, we see inauthenticity in everything we do. That becomes kind of the trap that we fall into. And then Hamlet, I think, is he sees a reflection in Polonius of his own propensity, I guess, for affectation. But Polonius is a comic figure, and Hamlet enjoys playing around with him. And the little scene that they have together is pretty funny, and I'll just allude to it briefly here. But Hamlet is out walking around with a book, and Polonius asks him, "What do you read, my lord?" And Hamlet said, "Words, words, words." Well, what Hamlet's doing here is saying basically there is no matter, there's no subject in the book, it's just words. And in early modern thinking, concentrating on words themselves was itself a problem of affectation. Francis Bacon had an essay where he basically talked about a vain search for the perfect word is just a form of affectation, that what matters is the topic or matter itself, not the style at all. And so Polonius, who knows the rules, right? He says, "What is the matter, my lord?" Like, what are you actually reading? I know it's words. What's the subject? And Hamlet says, "Between who?" And Hamlet is interpreting matter in a legal sense, right? It's a case between two people. That is one way of interpreting what matter is. So in a way, Hamlet is using Polonius's verbal affectations against him in this scene. And Polonius, we get to laugh at Polonius yet again because Hamlet is making a fool of him. All right, I think I'll stop there for now. To be continued.